My parents' anniversary dinner was held in a rented banquet hall on the edge of the city. It was the kind of place that photographs well but feels slightly worn when you're standing inside it. Soft lighting, cream tablecloths, gold decorations that reflected the ceiling lights in small, dull flashes. I arrived an hour early. No one asked me to. But someone always had to confirm the catering count, check the seating cards, and make sure the cake had actually been delivered. Over the years, that responsibility had simply settled with me. So I checked the tables. I fixed a mistake in the seating chart. I moved 2 chairs so my father's business partner could sit closer to the front. By the time the guests started arriving, everything looked smooth and intentional. Which was the goal? I was standing near the dessert table adjusting a stack of plates when my mother walked in with 2 of her friends. They were laughing about something from the drive over. One of the women looked at me and asked politely, "Oh, are you with the staff?" My mother didn't even slow down. She smiled and waved her hand lightly in my direction. "No," she said. "That's my daughter." Then she added, just loud enough for several nearby tables to hear. "She's not really the one we show people. She's just the one who keeps things running." A few guests laughed quietly. Someone raised their eyebrows but didn't say anything. No one corrected her. No one seemed uncomfortable enough to interrupt the moment. The conversation moved on almost immediately. I adjusted the plates again so they lined up evenly. Then I stepped aside as another group of guests walked past me toward the bar. That's when I understood something had shifted. Moments like that rarely feel dramatic while they are happening. They feel small, almost administrative. Just another sentence spoken casually in a room full of people who are busy paying attention to something else. But sometimes those small sentences reveal the structure of a relationship more clearly than years of conversation. They show you exactly how you are positioned inside a system. Not how people claim to value you, but how they actually use you. If you have ever been the person who quietly keeps things running while everyone else assumes everything will somehow work out, you probably recognize the feeling. Have you ever realized that the role people give you in a family is not always the role they believe you deserve? Sometimes it is simply the role that makes their lives easier. In my family, roles were never officially discussed, but they were always very clear. My father was the authority figure in public. He ran the family business and made most of the decisions that other people could see. When people described him, they usually used words like decisive or confident. What those words really meant was that he spoke first and expected everyone else to adjust around him. My mother managed the social structure. She decided who we invited to events. She controlled the tone of family gatherings. She knew which version of our family story should be presented to outsiders. My older brother was considered the future of everything. He was charismatic and comfortable in conversation. People liked listening to him explain ideas. My father often introduced him to business partners as the person who would eventually take over. And then there was me. I was the reliable one. When I was 12 years old, I was the child who remembered to bring the folder of documents my parents had forgotten on the kitchen counter. When I was 15, I quietly corrected a mistake on a banking form my father had filled out before it was submitted. When I was 17, I spent an entire weekend reorganizing stacks of business paperwork because the accountant had requested files no one else could locate. None of those moments were dramatic. They were practical. And practicality has a strange effect on family dynamics. The more useful you become, the less visible you are allowed to be. Reliability slowly turns into expectation. Expectation turns into assumption. Eventually people stop noticing the work entirely. They only notice when something stops functioning. Over time I became what my mother once described as the reasonable one. Which meant I solved problems quietly. I didn't argue. And I didn't make scenes. Being calm made everyone else comfortable. Being calm also made people careless. Most families develop invisible systems over time. Ours revolved around paperwork. The business generated contracts, financial records, tax documents, partnership agreements, and endless email threads discussing small operational decisions. My father disliked administrative work, and my brother rarely paid attention to details that didn't interest him. So gradually, without any formal conversation, the responsibility settled with me. At first it was simple tasks. Scanning receipts, sorting digital files, naming folders in ways that made them easier to search later. Then it expanded. I started maintaining the calendar that tracked filing deadlines. I created spreadsheets listing which contracts required renewal. When the lawyer requested documents, I was the person who located them. Over time the system became more organized than anyone expected. There were labeled folders for every year. archived email chains documenting negotiations, digital backups stored on external drives in case something failed. To my family, this looked like routine administrative work. Maintenance, background activity that kept the business functioning smoothly. No one asked how much access that work required. No one asked who controlled the records. They simply assumed the quiet person doing the work had no reason to question them. People often assume silence means acceptance. Sometimes it means observation. In my family, reacting emotionally usually confirmed the narrative someone else wanted to believe. If I objected to a joke, I was overly sensitive. If I questioned a decision, I was being difficult. If I defended myself, I was accused of creating drama. Eventually I understood something simple. In a system like that, confrontation rarely changes anything. It only makes the person speaking easier to dismiss. Silence, however, allows you to remain inside the conversation. It keeps the doors open. It allows people to continue forwarding documents and including you in processes without wondering whether they should. Silence preserved proximity. Proximity preserved awareness. And awareness can be very useful. Arrogance makes people sloppy, especially when they believe the quiet person in the room has no reason to challenge them. A week after the anniversary dinner, my parents hosted a smaller gathering at their house. This one was less formal. Just family, a few close friends, and two of my father's longtime business partners. People moved between the kitchen and the dining room carrying plates and glasses while conversations overlapped. My brother spent most of the evening talking about a new expansion idea. He described it confidently, the way he always did, as if the plan had already been approved. My father listened and nodded while the others at the table followed along. Eventually my father looked toward me. "You'll handle the paperwork for that," he said. It sounded automatic, like something that had already been decided. I said I would review the documents once they existed. My brother laughed. "Review," he said. "She'll practically run the whole thing. That's what she does." A few people smiled politely. Then he added something quieter, but still loud enough for the table to hear. "Everyone has a role. Mine is running the company. Hers is cleaning up the details after." My mother set down her glass and nodded slightly. "It works," she said. "Not everyone is meant to lead." No one challenged the comment. One of the partners looked briefly at me, then back at his plate. Someone asked about travel plans for the summer, and the conversation shifted again. But something about the moment was different from the anniversary dinner. This time it wasn't a passing remark. It was a definition, a clear explanation of how they believed the system worked, and how they believed it always would. I nodded once and finished eating. From their perspective, the conversation had confirmed the structure of the family. From mine, it clarified something else. They didn't realize what they had just handed me. The months that followed were quiet. From the outside, nothing appeared different. The business continued operating the way it always had. Meetings happened. Contracts were discussed. Deadlines approached and passed. My father continued making decisions quickly, and my brother continued presenting new ideas with confidence. And I continued doing the same work I had always done. Organizing files. Updating records. Answering emails when someone needed a document located quickly. But I started paying attention to details I had previously ignored. Whenever an email chain contained an important decision, I exported it and placed it in a dated archive folder. Whenever a contract was revised, I kept both versions. Whenever a financial spreadsheet was updated, I saved a copy of the previous one before replacing it. None of this interrupted the normal workflow. It simply meant the record became more complete. Gradually, a second layer of documentation began to form beside the original system. One labeled folder contained signed agreements. Another held email threads explaining how certain decisions had actually been made. A separate encrypted drive stored scanned copies of older paperwork that had never been digitized before. Sometimes the process was simple. A file moved into a folder. A conversation preserved as a PDF. Sometimes it required more patience. Boxes in storage were opened. Older contracts were scanned. Handwritten notes from past meetings were photographed and labeled with dates. None of this looked unusual. If someone walked into the room while I was working, they would have seen exactly what they expected to see. Administrative work. Routine organization. Quiet maintenance of the system that kept everything running. But over time the archive became very precise. Every decision had a timeline. Every change had a record. Every signature had context. And the longer the archive existed, the clearer the structure of the business became. Patterns appeared. Small contradictions surfaced between public explanations and private conversations. Details that had once seemed insignificant started fitting together in ways that were difficult to ignore. I never mentioned any of this to my family. There was no reason to. Documentation does not require confrontation. It only requires patience. So I continued doing what everyone expected me to do. Keeping the system organized. Making sure nothing was lost. Making sure everything could be found later. Preparation replaced reaction. About a year later, my father asked me to come to his office. A printed contract was waiting on his desk. He explained that the business was restructuring a portion of its ownership structure. According to him, the change was mostly procedural. Some permissions needed to be transferred between older agreements and new ones. My brother stood beside him reading something on his phone. Neither of them looked concerned. "We just need you to sign the authorization," my father said. I read the document carefully. The language transferred certain financial liabilities to the person signing the form, which meant the responsibility would move to me. My father watched quietly while I finished reading. Then he asked, "That won't be a problem, right?" The question wasn't hostile. It sounded routine, as if the answer had already been decided. I placed the paper back on the desk. And I said yes. The authorization required several verification steps before it could become active. One of those steps involved confirming existing corporate records. Because I maintained the digital archive, the verification request was automatically sent to my account. Along with that request came an option to attach supporting documentation. So I prepared a submission. Copies of older agreements were included. Communication records clarifying how certain financial decisions had been made were attached as references. The documents were organized chronologically. Each file was labeled clearly. No accusations were written anywhere. Just records. And signatures. When the package was uploaded, the review process moved forward automatically. Systems tend to take paperwork very seriously, even when people do not. The first letter arrived 3 weeks later. It was addressed to the business but delivered to my father's office. The envelope looked ordinary. White paper. Standard formatting. The kind of document people usually open without thinking very much about it. Inside was a notice that a compliance review had been opened regarding inconsistencies in several historical filings. My father called me that afternoon. His voice sounded more confused than concerned. He asked if I knew anything about it. I told him that I had completed the verification process connected to the authorization document he had asked me to sign. As part of that process, I had submitted supporting records from the archive. Which was true. At first, everyone assumed the issue would disappear quickly. Reviews happen. Paperwork gets clarified. Someone sends an explanation and the system moves on. But the second letter arrived the following week. This one requested specific documentation. Contracts from earlier years. Supporting financial records. Clarification about certain ownership structures that had changed without being formally recorded. My father called again. This time he asked where the files were stored. I told him exactly where they were. The folder names. The archive dates. The backup drives. A few days later the lawyer called. He sounded careful in the way people do when they are trying to understand something that should have been simple but is slowly becoming complicated. He asked whether all historical agreements had been preserved in the archive. I said yes. Over the next several weeks more requests appeared. Temporary holds were placed on certain business accounts until the review process finished. Auditors asked for clarification about transactions that had been explained casually in meetings years earlier but never formally documented. Those explanations now had to exist on paper. My brother began calling late at night. At first he sounded irritated, then impatient, eventually uncertain. He kept asking the same question in different ways. How far back did the records go? I answered honestly. Very far. As the weeks passed, something subtle changed inside the house where I had grown up. The easy certainty that usually defined my father's voice disappeared. Phone calls became shorter. Conversations paused in the middle. Meetings with lawyers appeared on the calendar more frequently than family dinners. No one confronted me directly. No one accused me of anything. But the confidence that had always surrounded their decisions slowly dissolved as the system continued asking questions. Because systems don't respond to confidence. They respond to records. And the records were now speaking for themselves. Several months later I returned to my parents' house one afternoon. Most of the business conversations were now happening between lawyers, accountants, and auditors. I went to the room where I had always kept my materials. There were a few boxes left that belonged to me. Personal notebooks. Old external drives. Reference manuals I had used while organizing the archive. I packed them carefully into my car. When I finished, I walked through the kitchen and placed my spare house key on the counter. No one was there to see it, which felt appropriate. I closed the door behind me. Then I left. Distance changes how systems look. Once I was no longer inside the daily routine of my family, the patterns became easier to recognize. For most of my life, the structure of that house felt normal. Roles existed. Expectations existed. And everyone behaved as if those roles had always been correct. My father made the visible decisions. My brother spoke about the future of the business. And I handled the details that allowed those things to function. No one ever described that structure as unfair. They simply described it as practical. For a long time I accepted that explanation, not because I believed it completely, but because challenging it seemed unnecessary. The system worked. Problems were solved. Documents were organized. Life continued moving forward. What I eventually understood was that the system only worked because someone inside it was quietly maintaining the structure. And the moment that maintenance stopped protecting the people in control, the structure began answering questions on its own. I never confronted my parents. I never raised my voice. I never tried to convince anyone they had treated me unfairly. I simply allowed the records to exist exactly as they were. Once the documentation entered the formal review process, the outcome no longer belonged to any single person. It belonged to procedure. And procedures do not respond to confidence, reputation, or family authority. They respond to documentation. When I left that house with the last of my boxes, I realized something else had changed as well. For the first time, I was no longer responsible for maintaining a system that required me to remain invisible. Whatever happened after that point would happen without me. Not because I forced it, but because I stopped preventing it. The last time I saw my parents' house in the rearview mirror, the gate was already closing behind me. And for the first time in years, nothing inside it belonged to me anymore. That was enough. Because the truth is, I didn't ruin them. I just stopped fixing what they broke. And once the system started checking the records for itself, it finished the rest.